Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to call us to order to welcome you all. This is our first Debating Europe session of the new academic year, and I think we've got a great panel to start us off with. Our main speaker is going to be Martin Wolf, or is Martin Wolf, who's going to speak, as you can see from the screen there, on the Eurozone crisis, sources, symptoms and solutions. Martin is I'm sure, known to all of you. He's the chief economics commentator of the Financial Times. He's been awarded the CBE for services to financial journalism, but he also has a number of connections with the academic world. He's an honorary fellow of both Nuffield and Corpus Christi in Oxford. He's an honorary fellow in the Oxford Institute for Economic Policy and an honorary professor at the University of Nottingham in the UK. He's been a Forum Fellow at the World Economic Forum in Davos since 1999, and is a member of its International Media Council. He was also a member of the UK government's Independent Commission on Banking from 2010 to 2011. And he's published most recently on Why Globalization Works and Fixing Global Finance. So a very warm welcome to you, Martin. He's going to speak for about half an hour, and then I'm going to ask our panelists here, who I'll introduce afterwards, to give a short reactions really to the initial presentation, and then we'll open it up for discussion. So thank you, Martin.
I don't think I've ever presented anything with so many discussants. I'm going to be interested to see whether they end up disagreeing more with one another than they do with me. I also enjoyed the introduction. It was very kind. When I'm introduced in the United States and people point out that I've been awarded something called the Commander of the British Empire, I like to comment that if nothing else, the fact that the British are still giving this honor shows that they haven't lost their sense of humor. We will probably still be giving this long after everybody has forgotten there ever was a British Empire. I am going to talk at a very high level, inevitably. This is a very complicated and fascinating crisis about which I've written a great deal and about which many others have written far more. And I can do no more than present a very broad overview of what I think the nature of the crisis is, where we are in it, and what very broadly needs to be done. There are some extremely interesting issues relating to, in particular, the behavior and role of the central bank, which I had thought of talking about and I'll touch upon, but it just raises, there are so many interesting technical issues there that I'm not going to do that in any great detail. So let me just sort of lay out in the normal way what I'm going to say and then say it. I should say, by the way, I was interested in when this incredibly beautiful place was built. I was told it was the time of the Renaissance, so I presume about 1500. I don't know whether that will be right. My college, Corpus Christi, was founded at exactly the same time, so it feels quite like being at home. Of course, the style's Gothic, not Renaissance. Okay, I'm going to start with something really provocative, or at least because it's important for you to understand where I come from. Obviously, I have been writing about economics for a very long time. Indeed, and I was already the chief leader writer of the Financial Times. I started my career at the World Bank, then I worked in a research institute on international trade, but from 1987 to 1996, I was chief leader writer of the FT before I became its economic columnist. So obviously, I followed very, very closely the idea of creating a European monetary union. And like many, I wasn't very original this, like many economists in the English-speaking world, that is to say, obviously Britain and the United States, but also elsewhere in Australia and Canada, we were very, very skeptical about this project. And it wouldn't be fair to say that everybody was. There was quite a big debate in Britain about it, and that debate persisted until the middle of the last decade. But the balance, in Britain it was a bit closer. In Britain I would say it was more 50-50 among economists. There were actually quite a lot of economists who were in favor of joining. They all pretend they weren't, but they were. And I was very much on the other side. In 1991, I was invited by my editor, who was aware of my reprehensible views, to engage in a debate with then our leading foreign columnist, Ian Davidson, on this new idea. Of course, December 1991 was the end of the Maastricht Treaty negotiating process, and I wrote a column in which I argued that this invention was going to create immense problems. And in particular, I predicted in this piece that the likelihood was that at some point there will be a crisis in which countries would find that they were being torn apart, not bound together, and that mutual resentment would grow immensely, with the creditors blaming the debtors for their imprudence and folly, and the debtors blaming the creditors for their hard-heartedness and brutality. And it concluded with the sentence you see before you, that the effort to bind states together may lead instead to a huge increase in frictions among them. Of course, instead of to harmony, peace, brotherhood, and the happiness of Europe. If so, the event would meet the classical definition of tragedy: hubris, arrogance, arty, folly, nemesis, destruction. So that, I just thought I should tell you where I came from. You probably also worked out that I was a classicist. Now, which indeed I was. Let me talk now about how I see the crisis in terms of its origins, its sources, the current symptoms, and the necessary solutions. Sources. There is a widely held view, particularly in Northern Europe, that this is essentially a fiscal crisis, and if everybody obeyed the fiscal rules, had obeyed the fiscal rules, this crisis could never happen. My view, and I've argued this now many times in the paper, is that this is incorrect. It's essentially a balance of payments and the common financial crisis, that is to say, a crisis in the financing of the balance of payments. What happened is that cross-border private financial flows within the Eurozone, which had of course been greatly promoted by, and indeed were intended to be promoted by, it was the aim of the currency union, suffered a series of what experts in developing country balance of payments crises would call, and do call, sudden stops after 2008. In fact, there's a very good paper published by Bruegel about a year ago, which I've cited, which shows quite precisely the dates of these sudden stops for the 5 crises hit countries. Some of these countries had several, and others just one or two. But what clearly happened is there were moments in which essentially private financial flows ceased, cross-border flows ceased, capital flowed the other way, and tremendous drains occurred from the government debt market, and even more important, from the financial system. As a result of these sudden stops, which triggered and were triggered by collapses in asset prices, very severe financial sector stress, there were very deep recessions, and in these very deep recessions, revenue collapsed, spending rose in the normal cyclical way, and fiscal crises emerged. So fiscal crises were in essence, or in large measure, I'll go in more precisely in a minute, a symptom of the crisis, not a cause. Of course, the view that this is a fiscal crisis allows the creditor countries to blame the debtor countries rather than seeing it as a product of the problem of the system. And I think that that sort of argument about the nature of the crisis is bad economics and even worse politics. The correct view, in my view, that this is a financial crisis puts blame on both the creditors and debtors, which is better economics and ought to be better politics. In other words, an immensely large number of people screwed up very big time. To make my point that the fiscal positions don't predict the crises, I've taken here sort of the most obvious sort of major Eurozone member countries, and I showed what their public finances looked like just before the crisis hit. So, and a simple measure, I've just tried to keep this quite simple, is net public debt relative to GDP. I think it's better than gross for fairly obvious reasons. And it's really quite fascinating because there are 5 countries, obviously, that have been in very severe trouble. Ireland, Spain, Portugal, Italy, and Greece. And you will see that their fiscal position doesn't predict that at all. There are 2 countries, Italy and Greece, which clearly did have high public debt. Greece was certainly an extreme case of crisis, Italy actually much more modestly so. Portugal's net public debt was very close to that of France and not dramatically above that of Germany. And Ireland and Spain had among the lowest net public debt positions of any countries in the Eurozone. Only Finland is out there in a class of its own with this absolutely enormous net asset position. And this is consistent, so obviously the question is, well, what happened when the crisis hit? Well, when the crisis hit, for the reasons I've tried to explain, you get a large recession, you get the fiscal consequences of a large recession, you also have to bail out your banking system if it gets into serious trouble, and as a result of all these things, your fiscal position deteriorates very, very quickly. As I said, Greece started off very bad, but as these data show, it got a hell of a sight worse very, very quickly. Italy, impressively, actually, for reasons I don't have time to go into, did a very good job of controlling its public finances in the crisis, but it still basically lost all the reduction in its net debt relative to GDP of the previous 10 years and got back more or less to where it started. Portugal, again, as I've already pointed to, was fairly close to France, but this very, very deep recession pushed roughly doubled net public debt in 5 years. And then you get to Spain and Ireland, which are really quite astonishing. In Spain's case, net public debt, according to the IMF forecasts, are going to go from in the mid-20s as a percentage of GDP to 80% of GDP in just 7 years. And I have never seen anything, and I followed these sorts of things very closely. Somebody may be able to point to another example. I've never seen anything like what has happened to Ireland, a country in which net public debt moved from 10% of GDP to over 100% of GDP in essentially 4 years. About 2/3 of that was due to the recession, and another third, there's a little bit of debate about this, was due to the banking collapse. So it's clear, one, that the fiscal position prior to the crisis did not predict whether a country got into crisis. Two, the crisis itself dramatically and very swiftly worsened fiscal positions. And in the case of Spain and Ireland, which started off with massive financial problems but no fiscal problem, the worsening was dramatic. And all this shows something that, of course, somebody like me who'd worked on developing countries knew very well. I'd learnt this many, many times, is that really big financial crises become fiscal crises very, very quickly. And it's the financial sector's implosion more often than the fiscal sector's implosion in recent times that has led to this sort of demolition. And a very good example of that was the Asian financial crisis. If we look at the current account positions, then whether you were a net recipient of capital or a net exporter of capital, however, you find something that predicts whether or not you end up in a crisis much, much better. I threw in Estonia here, but I'm not going to talk about Estonia more. Obviously, it also had a very large crisis. Not being in the Eurozone, its story is a little bit different. But you can see in terms of the average capital inflow over the 1997 to 2000 period, Portugal, Greece and Spain had gigantic capital flows, Ireland rather smaller, Italy also smaller, but they were large recipients of capital from abroad, had very large net international investment positions, and their expenditure was being consistently and strongly supported by the foreign capital inflow. Meanwhile, the Finlands, Netherlands, Belgium, Germany, Austria and France were all capital exporters, and by the way, you will have noticed none of them got into a serious crisis. So essentially, the best predictor of whether you got into a crisis was the current account. Now, I'm not trying to suggest that this was all on its own. It was crucial, though not as crucial as all that, it turned out, what it was financing. Of course, in the case of Greece, we know it was financing both large fiscal deficits and a large financial excess spending in the private sector. In Spain and Ireland, it was entirely in the private sector. Both Spain and Ireland were running quite sizable fiscal surpluses in the run-up to the crisis. It was a private sector boom that was being funded, essentially a property boom. In Italy, it was a bit of both, but not so large. In Portugal, again, it was a bit of both. There was a fiscal element and a sizable private element. The big problem that arose for the longer term is that during the period when there was this enormous inflow of capital financing the supply of tradable goods and services into the economies, there was a domestic boom, and the domestic boom pushed up domestic real wage costs, unit labor costs, to a quite extraordinary degree, and there was immense divergence in unit labor costs across the Eurozone as a byproduct of this capital flow process into these various booms or bubbles, whatever you want to think of them. Germany these are all relative to Germany. I should have said that. These are unit labor costs in manufacturing relative to Germany. And you can see that at least in the case of Greece, also in the case of Italy and Spain, there were immense deteriorations in competitiveness measured in this way relative to Germany, all of which will to some extent have to be recouped. Ireland was rather different. It never really did lose international competitiveness, and that's actually one of the things that is positive for Ireland now. Its external account is improving, but it does have the problem that its financial system has completely imploded. So why were the proponents of the Eurozone unaware of the dangers that current account imbalances and associated financial flows might pose not only for economic stability, but also for fiscal stability? It's an issue that I actually have discussed with senior policymakers, among them Jean-Claude Trichet. I had a big argument with him 4 years ago in which I argued that these current account imbalances could prove devastating if the financing turned round very, very quickly, as subsequently happened. And the basic answer to that is very, very clear from the literature of the 1990s and afterwards, with very few exceptions. They thought that the only danger that current account deficits could pose was currency danger, was currency risk. And that once they eliminated the currency crises that they'd experienced, of course, in the old ERM, the balance of payments would cease to matter. And they also thought that the one thing that the EMU had done is eliminate currency risk. But they were in fact wrong on both counts. Currency risk is not the only danger when there are huge current account deficits financed in this way within a currency union. And in fact, currency risk cannot truly be eliminated so long as the possibility of secession remains. It will re-emerge as credit risk, i.e. if you're frightened that a country might leave the currency union and you regard it as a non-zero possibility, you are going to reprice all the risk assets, all the assets in that country to allow for the danger that it might redenominate and disappear from the currency union. That's pretty clearly, I think, one of the reasons for the large interest rate spreads we've seen. But I would argue that even regions of countries can suffer from the consequences of current account imbalances. Of course, we don't normally count them because we don't look at regional current accounts at all, but they will show up as regional recessions. But for regions of countries, this is normally not a large economic or political problem, because mechanisms for handling the worst consequences of regional busts exist. There is temporary financial support. There's either support for the financial system in a country that say, a very famous example when Texas had its huge crisis in '86. There was, the Feds continued to support the banking system, so the banking system continued to function. There are, of course, automatic fiscal transfers, admittedly transfers to people, but they support income in the region that is in tremendous trouble. And there's normally substantial labor mobility, and these normally work well enough. And in addition to this, though I haven't stressed it, of course, normally in most countries, politics doesn't become extremely vexed at the regional level, because there's also representation at the national level which is legitimate and accepted as legitimate by citizens within badly affected regions. That's not always true, and you can get very considerable regional political stresses in crises of this kind. But among states, it's very different from politically from the situation among countries in a currency union. Eurozone member countries, of course, going into the crisis, didn't have mechanisms of support of the kind that I've described to deal with the consequence of their balance of payments come financing crisis. And that was deliberate, of course, because there was absolutely no agreement could never have been any agreement on the creation of such transfer and other mechanisms of support. And that's indeed the whole issue now, is how far in that direction the Eurozone is going to go. With one exception, which I'm going to come to in a moment, they were essentially in a gold standard type mechanism. In other words, they didn't have a currency, but they were essentially, in theory, in an irrevocably fixed peg system with among the countries, and they had classic mechanisms. We know very well what the classic gold standard type mechanisms of adjustment were. If you get a financing crisis of this kind, people have lent a great deal for a regional boom. They've realized it was a mistake. They pull out all their money. The banks implode. You get a collapse of the banking system. You get mass unemployment. You get fiscal crisis. You get reductions. You get mass bankruptcy. You reprice assets. Workers either leave the country concerned or they accept much lower wages and prices. It's an absolutely classic mechanism which we're very familiar with, but I always took the view, and that was my main reason for being very skeptical about the workability of this arrangement, that the politics would never allow that sort of mechanism to work, that countries would not allow that mechanism to work, which is in fact the mechanism we are seeing working in the Baltics. And in my last point here, I am quoting, though I'm not going to tell you who it is, a current minister of the Italian government with whom I discussed this very issue of the adjustment mechanism for Italy a little over a year ago. And I argued, look, you signed up for this. You clearly had to accept this classic mechanism of adjustment. And he said, no, we do not accept it. We are not Latvia. That's the politics of it. Now, an important fact which has made the adjustment slightly different from what I've described, and it's not slightly different, significantly different from what I described, and I did not realize how important that exception would be, and it's, I think, the big issue going forward, as I say, from now, is that though the classical mechanisms apply fiscally, essentially fiscally, as I've described, this is an arrangement among sovereign states which are dependent on their own fiscal resources, or have been. They did have a central bank, and the central bank automatically extended cross-border financing. And indeed, my friend Hans-Werner Sinn has spent a lot of time complaining about the extent to which the central bank has automatically extended cross-border financing through its lender of last resort operations, which are of course shown up in the so-called Target 2 balances. But so the central bank has funded countries in difficulty, but it's not the same, and we've seen it very clear, as having your own central bank in a crisis. And I'm going here to follow Paul de Groot, who's now at the LSE, used to be at Leuven, who made the, I think, very striking and telling contrast between Spain and the UK, which in many respects are in a similar position, but one does have a central bank and the other doesn't. One has a floating exchange rate and the other doesn't. And the differences in their fiscal position now are quite startling. And I think the explanation is the existence of currency risk, liquidity risk, and default risk in Spain because it's a sub-sovereign entity. This chart shows the IMF's forecasts for the net public debt ratio for the UK and Spain up to 2012, and you can see that the net public debt position of the UK is clearly worse than that of Spain. It has a worse fiscal position, so it ought to have a higher yields on government bonds. But in fact, from the beginning of the Eurozone crisis in early 2010, quite the opposite happened. The UK, which has a central bank which is credibly committed to having extremely low interest rates for the indefinite future, now enjoys the lowest long-term bond yields in the entire history of the UK. The lowest and our history of the UK bond market is well over 300 years. So that's quite extraordinary. Meanwhile, the yields on Spain, of course, have gone through the roof, as we all know, and we are now discussing the exact nature of the special program that Spain will have. The conclusion I've drawn from this is that countries inside currency unions are actually more vulnerable to balance of payments and financial crises than advanced countries with floating exchange rates and their own central banks. They are much more like emerging countries with exceptionally hard exchange rate pegs, and as I've already indicated to you, they were neither politically nor economically prepared for coping with the implied adjustment process. And that was a point I made again and again personally in discussions I had in Spain and in Italy in the 90s, when they were all telling me that they wanted to join this, and I asked them whether they were prepared for the crisis adjustment process they would face if there were a crisis. And the answer we now know is they weren't. Let me go now to symptoms. It's not that long. I can get through it, I believe, in time. So that, in my view, is the analysis. It's my analysis of the crisis, of its nature, the flows of funds, the sudden stops, therefore, for countries which were very dependent on external finance, the immediate collapse of their economies, the collapse of their fiscal systems, the financial crises, and all the rest. An absolutely classic mechanism, ameliorated in significant way by the willingness of the central bank to fund the banking system, and of course more recently now to fund governments. We'll come to that in a moment. So the symptoms of the crisis, numbered second section, are dwindling cross-border finance, capital flight and bank runs, exorbitant bond yields in deficit countries. We can argue whether they're exorbitant or not, but anyway, bond yields which teeter on the edge of being unsustainable for countries whose growth prospects are relatively poor. Real interest rates of 5 or 6% are not, in the long run, sustainable. Very much tighter links between domestic banks and their governments. One of the most important consequences of this crisis is the disintegration of the financial sector of the Eurozone, exact opposite of what the Euro was supposed to do. There's been a much greater reliance on domestic funding for both businesses and governments, very dangerous for their banks, of course, very deep recessions and soaring unemployment, I'll come to in a moment, political and economic stresses, and rising cross-border political friction. This just shows what happened to yields. We all know that in the halcyon days before the crisis, up to 2008, the spreads on government bonds in the Eurozone were essentially zero. They were all treated as having identical risk. Then in a very short period, it went from essentially zero to, in the case of Greece, say, by May 2010 to 10 percentage points, in Ireland and Portugal 5 percentage points, and they continued to shoot up into 2011, when they essentially were bailed out by the IMF programs, government programs, and the ECB. And there's been some reduction. Those spreads remain very high for Portugal. Ireland is, for various reasons, the most successful. And this is what happened to, even for France, spreads blew out, though they remained clearly manageable, but for Italy and Spain, they blew out really quite dramatically. And it is important to note, it's relevant to our thinking about the future, that you will see after they blew out to get to 5–6% roughly, spreads in the summer of 2011, there have been two periods when they were brought back down again. The first was when the ECB announced its long-term refinancing operation in the end of 2011. You can see these very steep declines didn't last, and you can see more recently another set of steep declines following the announcement of the OMT, and I wonder whether that bounce in the prices of these bonds is going to last. But certainly, interestingly, the decline in the yields was not as great as the LTRO proposal announced. And as I've indicated, because these are relatively rigid economies suffering enormous shocks, unemployment has exploded in Spain to 25%, Greece to 20%, Ireland to 15%, Portugal to 15%, and there's very little chance that this is going to fall in the near future. In fact, there's every chance it's going to get higher in some countries in the near future. And also, as I've noted, I put here the figures for GDP. You can see even relatively successful countries like Ireland on the external competitiveness side have been stuck in very deep recessions now, going on now into the third year. The same, it's true in Greece, it's continuing on down. The Greeks have even stopped producing GDP figures after early 2011. I wonder why. Italy's falling again very rapidly. Italy's GDP is now pretty well back to where it was 12 years ago. Spain is back in recession, steadily declining, and these recessions are going to go on for years. The forecasts for this year showed consensus forecasts over the successive months collapses for Italy, Spain, Ireland, and Portugal, and they show, not for Ireland, but for Portugal, Spain, and Italy, again for 2013, they're all showing further declines. These countries are going to be in recession, in my view, from the starting point, for 5 to 10 years. That's, I suspect, the adjustment process that they're going to go through, and it will be interesting to see what the political consequences are. So let me just wrap up. How is the Eurozone going to resolve the crisis that is being caused by what it has created, in essence what it's created, and how it operated in those first halcyon years of capital flows? I see two scenarios, partial or complete breakup, or an extended and painful period of adjustment and reform. The former will be, I think, a catastrophe. I remain of that view, and the latter will merely be very costly. I also think the latter is the more likely. I think that we are probably going to see a long and painful process of adjustment and reform and misery and complaints and anger and frustration, in fact, everything that makes Europe strong. How do we solve this? My starting point is there are a large number of losses in the system, and they have to be accepted, and it will be a very good start if creditor countries started writing off quite a large part of what they provided to the debtor countries. So debt restructuring is clearly an important part of what needs to happen. Much of what is happening, however, is the transfer of private losses onto the taxpayer, and the question remains being whether in the end the creditors or the debtors taxpayers ultimately pay. And a large part, I think, of the debate is about who ultimately pays. But clearly the deficit countries cannot repay without, in aggregate, moving into surplus. That's how you do repay, and that requires external adjustment in the core. Here are some salient examples of challenges to be resolved. The program, the economic program, is essentially a combination of financing with adjustment, though the financing may include, as I've said, some substantial amount of debt restructuring in both the private and public sector accounts. This process is going to take many years because the real adjustments involved are going to take many years because the economies got so distorted during the booms. Financing, I think, will mean some kind of banking union, as in any other federal union, that is to say, federal support for the banking system, once debt restructuring has occurred, maintenance of manageable costs of government funding. All this is pretty standard international stuff. It's the way the IMF dealt with the Asian financial crisis. But adjustment means structural reform and divergent inflation across the Eurozone, and inevitably a period of higher inflation in the core countries. The big dangers are inadequate financing, and so deep defaults generating a Eurozone-wide banking crisis, extremely rapid fiscal tightening in the periphery together with absence of adjustment in the core, and so even deeper and more prolonged recessions than I've described. And either way, there are very big political risks in the years ahead. I think that covers what I have to say. There is an enormous amount of detail, and I understand almost everything I've said is controversial and provocative, and I hope we can have an enjoyable debate. Thank you for listening.
I think if I speak into the microphone, people will be able to hear me. So the problem is that there's perhaps not as much disagreement among economists on these topics as you might think. So I could pick a few points here and there with Martin, and I'm sure you'd be terribly bored because I don't think anybody except for the two of us would care that much. So I'm going to try to say something in a little bit more Englishy, but I think largely I'm going to be agreeing. So the issue that's being raised is whether the euro is somehow the cause of the crisis, or institutions around the euro are the cause of the crisis, or, well, obviously that's not true, or whether they've aggravated the crisis, which I think is a more serious question. Without these particular institutions, if Spain had been more like Britain and had its own central bank and its own currency, would it have been affected less by the crisis that hit it? Now there's a lot of things that are different between England and Spain. One was pointed out, is the unemployment rate, which is 8% in England, 25% in Spain. And the essential point is Spain can't just say, hey, we're England, and expect all the problems to go away. I think the Spanish more or less realize that. But the institutional issue that goes around the currency union is a lack of clarity about who is going to pay for what, right? And in particular, we have a lot of experience with systems like this, right? Systems where one person writes the checks, right, and another person actually puts the money into the bank account. So if Spain gets to spend money and Germany picks up the tab, I think it's pretty obvious what the problem is with a system of that sort. Brazil tried this. The provinces in Brazil got to spend whatever they wanted, and the federal government was responsible for the debt that they incurred. Needless to say, the provinces in Brazil ran up huge, huge amounts of debt. You see the same problem internally within Spain. The federal government may or may not be responsible for the debts of the provinces. That's a little bit unclear at this point. But what's certain is that the provinces in Spain, the regions in Spain, ran up very large amounts of debt and are now negotiating with the federal government in Spain over who's going to pay it. So Catalonia, for example, has enormous debt and are now trying to secede from Spain in an effort to avoid having to pay the debt. Okay, we go to the second slide. All right. So we can debate the finer points about how all this came about. Okay. I'm going to quote actually from one of Martin's slides here. Much of what is happening is the transfer of private losses onto the taxpayer. That was actually remarkably the case in Ireland, where about 25% of their additional debt was acquired within a period of about 24 hours, when the government decided that they would assume all of the private bank debt in the country. The question remaining being whether the creditors or the debtors, taxpayers ultimately pay. So the point is a very simple point, right? In a crisis like this, Greece can't repay its loans. Actually, half of them have been written off already, right? Spain can't repay its loans. These countries cannot repay their loans. So the question is, who loses, right? Is the taxpayers of Spain going to pay, or the taxpayers of Germany going to pay? Are the bondholders of the banks in Spain going to pay, or are the taxpayers going to pay? And so, in order to get things, we've been through a lot of these financial crises in a lot of different countries. And I think economists know pretty much what the correct answer to this is, and I think I'm going to be agreeing with the other economists on this, right? The solution is, two things have to happen. First of all, the losses have to be allocated in a particular way so that everybody knows who lost what. And the second thing is it has to be credible. That is, the people who are required to pay there must be some reasonable prospect that they're actually going to pay. If I say Spain pays everything, or if I say Germany pays everything, then it's silly because everybody knows that's not going to happen. Okay. The problem is pretty easy to describe. How does a company in Spain get financing for a new project? They go to a Spanish bank and they borrow money. Where does the Spanish bank get the money from? Germany perhaps, some Germans buy their bonds. Why don't Germans want to buy bonds from Spanish banks? Because these Spanish banks are bankrupt. They owe way more money than they can ever repay, and if I lend them money, there's a pretty good chance when they really go bankrupt, I'll lose my money along with everybody else. So of course I'm not going to lend money to a Spanish bank. I'd be crazy to lend money to a Spanish bank. I'd be crazy to lend money to the Spanish government for exactly the same reason. Right? So a company maybe with a very good project in Spain can't get financing because of this financial crisis, right? And this has an impact on employment and all the other things that are going bad in Spain right now, right? Now, given that we know what the answer is, and we can see if any economist in the room wants to raise their hand and say, no, that's not, we shouldn't do that, it's not a good idea to allocate the losses clearly and credibly, but I don't think anybody wants to raise their hand, feel free at this point. I don't think we're going to get a lot of hands. Why don't they do it, right? So the answer to that is pretty simple. Nobody wants to admit how much money they lost. They're no different than you or me. If I'm in bankruptcy, I want to, you see this in the movies, right? The guy owes all this money to the mafia, and the knee breakers come around, and he says, oh, no, I can repay you tomorrow. Just give me 24 hours. They want to pretend that the problem isn't there, right? The Germans want to pretend that they haven't lost money. The Spanish government wants to pretend that they haven't lost money, right? And if we look across historical times and episodes, what we discover is that lots and lots of countries make this mistake for exactly the same reason. There's exceptions. There's Sweden. There's Chile. But, the United States has done exactly the same bad thing that the European Union has done. Maybe the famous case of the Japanese zombie banks that went on for decades being bankrupt, in effect, right? So, in the end, we can tell politicians what to do. In the end, they're going to lie and they're going to pretend that really they don't have to do it. And we can explain both of those things, but unfortunately that doesn't advance the cause of greater economic prosperity for anybody. So we'll just have to keep telling them to do it, and they'll keep ignoring us.
Thank you. Massimiliano.
Yep. So thanks. Let me start by thanking Martin for this very clear and thought-provoking presentation. And, my chair is on the monetary integration, monetary union, so no union, no chair. So I have kind of an interest here to defend. But, still I kind of agree quite a lot with Martin with what he said, but I'm pretty convinced that economic and monetary integration is still quite a good idea in a global world. Before it was US and Russia, now we have China, we have India, we have Brazil. In a world like this, small countries like Spain or Greece or even Italy and so on, I don't think would have much possibilities and so on. And something that it's also not discussed so much is also what would have happened with this crisis without the euro. So would have Spain really been better just with a central bank? And I mean, I don't know. On this, I agree more with David. I don't think that they would have been so much better. And if I take the case of Italy, that of course I know much better, if I look at what was happening, say, before the 90s, when this idea of the monetary union started to really take off, I mean, Italy did very bad. And we had to devalue something like 12 times in 15 years, exactly because of the behavior of unit labor cost, you know, economy was not working, and so on. So, in a sense, I, still believe that this is good, and in the medium term, as Martin was saying, I also believe that it's going to improve and to work. But what I really agree on with Martin is that the next years will be really painful for us, in particular, for the southern belt of the euro area. And what worries me most is that basically this crisis, that I totally agree, it's not an easy crisis. It's a financial, banking, fiscal, so it's really a mixture that kept rotating and repeating itself. Now, as you have seen, this has blown into a fully fledged social crisis. So this is a picture that I have borrowed from Martin's slides, on which he had to go very fast. So let me go a bit deeper. This is the unemployment rates. You see that Spain, you're at 25%. Then you have Greece and Ireland close to that. But you even have France and Italy at 10%. So if you put the numbers and you sum them up, you get more than 15 million people unemployed at the moment in the euro area. 15 million people. And so, my idea is that this thing is going to be fairly problematic, because you cannot keep so many people unemployed for very long before these people, really get mad, and they are right, And so there are a few solutions that have been proposed to this problem. So you have the ECB German solution, that is the idea that you have to have structural reforms, and you want to liberalize product and labor markets. And if I think of it in economic terms, this reflects kind of what is called classical paradigm. And so, there are market imperfections. These market imperfections keep real wages too high. So if you remove the imperfections, you get lower wages and more employment. And the problem is that I think that this is something that works, but in the long run. So maybe in 10 years' time, we will be much better due to the reforms that we have been implementing. But the problem is that the same reforms in the short run have costs. So there is a nice study of the OECD on the costs of structural reforms, and this is exactly what comes out. You have costs in the short run and benefits in the long run, and this is why you should implement the reforms when the economy is booming and not when the economy is already in a recession like now. So the timing is totally wrong. So the kind of other view on this is the Keynesian view. So this is the Keynesian, so the Keynesians of, the 30s. And so the idea here is that in the short run, it's aggregate demand that defines the output level, and then the output level, given the technology, determine employment. And so in this setup, if you want to lower unemployment, you need to just increase aggregate demand. Okay, so those kind of long-term structural reforms are good, but again, in the short run, will not work. And then this kind of thought has been further elaborated, is what is now called New Keynesian economics, if you wish. And so here, the idea is that the link between real wages and employment is kind of indirect. And so the idea is that if lower wages yield lower inflation, and if the central bank loses monetary policy because inflation is lower, then the lower interest rates stimulate demand, and so there is also a role for this. And so my main question for Martin is basically, what should we do in the short run for these 15 million people that are unemployed? And here, I don't know, again, I have views that are not so good, because, if you want to increase aggregate demand, you can have a fiscal stimulus, but for the moment we have exactly the opposite. And so what one could imagine is, a credible commitment to spend more today and spend less tomorrow. But at the time where we are, this is fully not credible, at least not for Southern Europe. So this cannot be done. You could have looser monetary policy, but the ECB target, contrary to the Fed, is not growth, employment, output, the real economy. The ECB target is just inflation and the stability of the financial system. And also, it's not so obvious that monetary policy works when interest rates are already so low. Okay. Also, quantitative easing, there is this big debate in the US on how much impact it really has. And so, you can think, okay, maybe more export, okay? And in principle, this could work, but if you want to increase export, you should have devaluation, and instead the euro is still pretty strong. We are back at 1.30 or even more than that. And part of this, it's also, what the other central banks are doing. So if the Fed starts quantitative easing and the ECB does not start quantitative easing, it's natural that the euro appreciates, and it's like this. Plus, as also Martin was saying, you have world demand that it's weakening, so not so much is going on for this through demand. And so you could think of private consumption, but private consumption, in particular in the southern part of Europe, is going down. But it's not so much better in the rest of the euro area. And this is natural because income is going down and wealth is going down. So you cannot expect much more. And so what is left is investment, private investment in particular. But here you have, again, all these credit constraints that also David was mentioning, a lot of uncertainty and so on. So I would really like to know what Martin thinks could be done in the short run, because I think this is really going to be crucial, because now we are solving, say, the next 5 or 10 years, but we have to get there, and the next 1 to 3 years could be very problematic, I think. Thanks.
Yes, I very much took interest in this talk. Enjoy is not quite the right word, but it's good to see somebody with the civil or the economic courage to look things in the face and say they're likely to get worse for reasons that you laid out. But I think I will speak for the error term and ask you a few questions about the dynamics of the institutions that are currently in place, because I don't think they're capable of carrying right down to the end of the road, which is a bottomless pit. First of all, your definition of Europe was selective. Let me throw 4 categories at you. EU, Eurozone states, countries such as Sweden and the UK, which are not committed to the Eurozone, what I call the St. Augustine Club, the countries that are committed to join the Euro, but not yet. And clearly, this ought to be an advantage to all sorts of people in new EU states who've seen worse than what we're looking at now. And fourth, a category which is logically possible, which is countries that are temporarily or permanently ex-members of the Eurozone. Currently nil, but bookmakers exist. Question, what sort of shifts, assuming these countries in these 4 categories are not going to stay stuck in them, that would be implausible, what sort of shifts do you see? Will this be good news or destabilization? Secondly, as I read the economic stability mechanism, it's politically something that I've never seen done by national governments, Because in year one, you make estimates of revenue and expenditure in year two. And this becomes a critical number in Brussels with sanctions. In year two, you're operating in a fog. And in year three, later in year three, you find out where you've been. Now, it seems to me that the error margin is far greater than the penalties margin, whether the penalties are on the countries that cut their budgets on the assumption things aren't going to get better, or whatever. Thirdly, when you look at national governments being asked to take a couple of percent out of GDP out of their budget, everybody thinks there's a Department of Waste or a Department of Privatization. There isn't. The big money is in pensions, health, and education. So if you're going to have to take a significant chunk out, people will notice it, elected politicians will notice this. 30 years ago, I wrote a book called Can Government Go Bankrupt?, actually starting in the Medea. And the bad news is no, they get refinanced. You make the point, who bears the cost? But the interesting thing is that governments were operating independently of each other. That is to say, you look at Sweden, you even look at the United States as a country. You weren't looking at interdependencies. And I think that your talk about narrow, capital flow imbalances accepts the point, but it doesn't go far enough. If you look at 17 countries operating independently, maybe 3 would have come up with the European stability mechanism. They certainly wouldn't have been 17 or 25. When you go back to national governments, you will have to ask yourself, why should elected cabinet ministers go along with something if they're not drunk and not given a weekend's notice? People have been learning. And I think at that point, one is going to have some disruptions in what is the inertia persistence model you've done. And I think it's also fortunate that Marise is here, because she can tell us how the European Court of Justice will get national courts to enforce European law on popularly elected democratic governments.
Thank you.
Well, I admire Martin Wolf's analysis today and throughout the crisis for the clarity it's brought to the situation of seeing this not as a problem solely or mainly of profligate southern states, but as a problem of adjustment on both sides. But I'm a political scientist, and so I have no holes to poke in the very substantial economic argumentation that was made, but I'd like to talk about the very sparse political presentation that was made and say a little bit more about it, because I only have one question, but I'm an academic, so it'll take 5 minutes to ask it. But my question is, how can this possibly work? Because there were two sorts of adjustment involved. One was financing, i.e. the banking union, shared risk. We call that redistribution, and so that's taking money from some people and giving it to other people. It tends to be hard to do, we find, even in established political systems, not nascent political systems, dysfunctional political systems, not to point any fingers. And second, there's the politics of adjustment, where the periphery needs structural reform. You're in the periphery, in case you wondered. And I always thought this was the core of Europe here, but it's not. The Roman Empire was a long time ago, and so we're now in the periphery because the periphery is defined economically, not geographically, spatially. And in the core, which is now in Germany, which was the woods so many years back, is... yeah, well, there you go. So I don't want to engage with the classicists on this terrain. It would make me look bad. The problem of bringing higher inflation. So as a political scientist, I look at the politics of adjustment there, and I say, so what he's saying is we need to overthrow the policy compromises of the dominant social coalitions in both countries. Okay, so the workers and the employers in Germany who have used this model very successfully to make the export wonder, and the sort of patchwork coalition in Italy that supports a very fragmented polity. So we need redistribution and we need to overthrow social coalitions. That, my friends, is a revolution. And so it's relatively hard to bring about, certainly by peaceful means, certainly with the institutions that we have. And so I'm interested, how would that possibly be legitimated, made possible, brought about by the acts of politicians? I think it requires solidarity, and I think it requires collective mobilization. My answer about where solidarity would come from would start with where it cannot come from. And it cannot come from the discussion of solidarity that has been mouthed so many times by the elites in Brussels who say we have to be solidaristic, which means we need to redistribute other people's money. That's not what I'm talking about. That solidarity is perceived as not resonating with a European populace which doesn't feel itself European. It feels itself as Greek or Italian or German, and so reads the distributional stakes very differently. Now, real solidarity, as we know it in politics, is developed by shared risk or shared membership. And I think membership in the Eurozone right now has roughly as much emotive attachment for most Europeans as my membership of Lufthansa Miles and More. I have a card, I belong, but it doesn't really make me want to sacrifice a lot for the other Miles and More members. Now, shared risk, however, now we're talking. And so I think that one incipient mechanism in the Wolf analysis is to see how bad things could get if we were actually to break up the currency union. And one possible way would be if a country were to leave and then to watch what happened in that country, sort of pour encourager les autres. We could call that example Greece. But something like that one could imagine, but it's not clear that that would do the trick, and it's not clear what the consequences would be. But let's imagine that we don't do that, that we choose something less cataclysmic. We try to develop a political rationale for redistribution. I think Europe has tried to do this. Europe, qua the European Union, has tried to do this before, and it's roughly a kind of a shared opportunity for those who were lucky because they were born smart. Most of the people in this room had that luck. Most of the people in this panel had that luck. And so, therefore, the European Union has been really good to you. Yes, note I said most. So there have been lots of opportunities from open borders. You know, you've lowered cell phone costs because you travel a lot. All these sorts of payoffs. You married someone that you met because you went to another university in another country. Those possibilities are not redounding to the entire population. And so what we need is a redistribution that is not about no one hurts, but everyone gets a little bit, because it's not everyone getting a little bit, and some people have hurt from the process, but one that entails a narrative about giving and taking and what social justice represents. That's very hard to create at the European level, but I would argue that that is one alternative way to get to the political sorts of compromises that we need. Now, just a minute on institutions, and it really will be a minute. How could this work at the European level? It could not work through the European Parliament. There's no more derided institution than the European Parliament, which doesn't matter, and we know that through political science data about voting that have been done by people in this room, than possibly the American Congress, which does actually matter and is deeply despised. But at least it takes decisions, when it occasionally does take decisions, that matter. And the European Parliament is not in that situation, and it's not clear what the road would be to the European Parliament occupying that situation, where it could be the site, the forum for big new social compromises to be forged. So if that won't work, A second possibility could be, well, maybe Merkel and Hollande will solve it for us. You know, they're coming up with institutional innovations every week. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't, but some sort of elite compromise. I tend not to think that that can work. I see that again as sort of incipient in the message here that the elites will come up with something, the populaces will adjust to it, they'll take this unemployment and say, well, this is the cost of progress. I'm not sure it's seen as progress, and I'm not sure that the sort of social unrest that Massimiliano talked about so eloquently in the little time he had can be born with this sort of elite-driven project that is not justified. So what do I see? I don't see European institutions that can do it. I don't see an elite consensus as being able to do it, and I don't see the possibility for institutional reform anyway in the European Union, which is not what is needed. So my answer, and I don't think it necessarily will work, but at least it ticks all the boxes, is that somehow you have to take what's happening at the level of Merkel and Hollande and use it to re-energize the way that political parties engage with their populaces, but more importantly, engage in a cross-border way, such that when you have an elite compromise between the left and the right in the Netherlands, it's not merely about saying, yes, we want more Europe, and we're not going to argue about the things that are dividing us. It's arguing about the things that divide us, because arguing about the things that divide us is how you actually politically justify them and say, these are compromises that we have to make. We disagree, there are winners and losers, but here is the broad story of why we're going to make this particular compromise. And national parties have the thing going for them that they already exist, they don't have to be created, they just have to be reinvigorated because they're currently on their deathbed across the industrialized countries and including in Europe. And this gives them a project and gives possibly a hope for the years ahead not being as grim as has been painted today in the talk.
Thank you. Okay. Open the floor for comments, questions. Yeah.
I greatly enjoyed this talk, and I'm following Martin's columns in the Financial Times regularly. Despite that, I disagree, of course, with a number of things he has been saying. Now, I would like to make two remarks. The first one is on the UK. So you very impressively showed us that the UK's yields are on an historical low compared to Spain's yields. And you related that to the fact that UK has a central bank which is committed to low interest rates and a flexible exchange rate with the other world currencies. What you didn't show us, however, are the IMF projections on GDP growth in the UK. What you didn't tell us is that the UK, on top of that, experienced a period of increased competitiveness by the pound being depreciated against the euro, and nevertheless manufacturing in the UK over that period ailing at, well, very disappointing growth rates, if there was any growth at all. So the UK, as a country which is not in the euro, has also not done too well, I would think, and I think the projections for the near future for the UK are not too well as well. Now, let's come to your conclusions. You conclude, and you changed a little bit your position. I guess 1 year ago you predicted the euro would break up and would have to break up. Today, perhaps not. Today, the other possibility you mention is that there is an extended and painful period of adjustment and reforms. Now, what is bad about that? I think the key question to ask here is for each of the countries you mentioned, like Spain, Italy, Greece, and Ireland, what would be the counterfactual situation? What would be the situation these countries experienced had they not been part of the European Monetary Union? I would think, like the UK, many of these countries would see themselves in great economic difficulties. Now, singling out countries, two countries, Greece and Italy, every country has different problems, I think, so it's kind of wrong, I believe, to look at them all at the same time. Now, these two countries have institutional crises besides financial and fiscal crises. I would think that the resolution of these institutional crises in these countries would have to come anyway. It is perhaps coming a little bit earlier by these countries being part of the European Union. And I would believe, and I actually do believe, that in the longer run, this makes the resolution of these institutional crises, which at the moment take these countries away from being fit for being competitive for the 21st century, make the resolutions a little bit cheaper probably in the long run than what we would otherwise see.
Thanks. Yeah, I think we can hear. It's to follow on of Christian's remarks. First of all, thanks for the presentation and all the discussions. I agree a lot in the diagnosis. But just a couple of things. One is, as you have done many times in the Financial Times itself, it's really good sometimes to see these pictures just the 10 years before. And before that period of the IRM, we had this kind of divergence. Of course, it was called exchange risk, but it was pretty much what it was, the same countries, Greece, Spain, and so on. It's also true that all these countries, we got a big boast of being in the Union, of having very low interest rates, in addition of some transfers and so on. It's true that Spain unemployment is extremely high. It's pretty much what it was in the mid-90s, with the difference that now 10 million more people are in the workforce in this period. So Spain and Ireland were the miracles during a period. Of course, we had to digest all that because, as it was said, not the reforms were done there. Spain has done the experiment of Keynesian politics to the maximum of the fiscal stimulus. It's one of the leading examples in the world. It certainly didn't work. The second thing I wanted to mention is, that you didn't mention, but you had many times too, is the role of the Union itself. On one hand, denying all the time the problem for a long time, or creating a lot of confusion. What do I mean a lot of confusion? Creating the confusion that if anything happens with Greece, the whole system breaks out. If there's any small form of default, of banking default, the whole system breaks down. That, I think, has created a lot of confusion. Because it created this image that either you bail out everything or you do nothing. On the other hand, it's true that it had put a lot of things on the table. And for example, now we have the European Stabilization Mechanism. That could be a system of resharing. It's not the way it is now because it's perceived as an ultimate stigma, even to call. That's why Rajoy doesn't dare to call the door, which is ridiculous.
Okay, this is going to be a short question, I hope. Paul Krugman argues in his book that the US could end their depression if they just applied a big fiscal stimulus over the next 2 years. So my question is, because I agree that Europe is living in a tragedy, my question is, was this almost entirely avoidable? Had the EU woken up after Lehman Brothers and smelt the coffee and done the following, what state would the Eurozone be in now if they had changed? If the EU had done the following post the Lehman Brothers crash, if they'd said, oh my God, this is going to be a nightmare. If they had done not what they have done, but if they'd done the following, could we be living in a completely different Eurozone? That's my question. So they would have changed the ECB mandate to target moderate inflation, employment, and have a GDP target. They would have applied a huge fiscal stimulus across Europe. they would have encouraged more labour mobility in practice, building on the very strong rules allowing labour mobility in Europe anyway, and they would have acted as one to limit the currency and liquidity risks associated with a multi-state single currency. So yeah, my question is, could this all have been avoided?
There have been a lot of very, very interesting, important points. I hope those whose I slight, because it would take an hour clearly to provide adequate responses to these questions and points, and I'm sure they wouldn't be regarded as adequate anyway. I will just comment on a few things that struck me. First, on the economists, I thought that the two comments from the economists they were perfectly complementary. This is a point I didn't make as well as I could have done in this talk, but because I was really trying to establish what I think happened and how to think about it and where that leaves us, rather than to think through all what has to be done. But I see, the way I think of this is and I think it fits very well, there's as it were, a stock problem and a flow problem. What I mean by that, the stock problem is what David focused on. David, yes? Namely, that a large number of mistakes were made by both lenders and borrowers, as a result of which losses have been incurred. And some part of those losses, and it's an interesting debate which is related to the flow point, how large those losses are, and we don't know because it depends on the future. But the losses are large and they have to be allocated. And I think that fits with also what you said. And there is a very interesting and important question about how to clean up after these losses. It's important to stress the uncertainty about these and also the extreme difficulty for many in accepting the scale of the losses, because it is quite likely that some part of the adjustment will include default by major states, major developed states. And defaults by major developed states are big things, not Greece. But that's clearly an important part of the story, is doing the stock adjustment. There is a tremendous battle going on inside the world, of which the Eurozone is just a part, on how that should be done and who should bear the losses. And it is, of course, as you would expect, many-sided. Different bits of the private sector are arguing with one another. They're all arguing with their governments. The governments are all arguing with one another, and they can't agree. There's no surprise about that. But that's the stock problem. And then there's the flow problem, which is, as it were, getting back to health, which is what Massimiliano talked about. How do economic developments went in a bad way, because a lot of people made very serious mistakes. I'm going to come in a moment to what the euro had to do with those mistakes and how they relate to the British mistakes, and what I foresaw before it all happened. But clearly, some of those mistakes, or if you like, some of those distortions, maladjustments, whatsoever, are the product of 2,000 years of history, okay? And some of them are things that happened relatively recently, but something has to be done about them. And Massimiliano made the important point that if you try to correct these mistakes predominantly in the deficit countries, on the assumption that, by definition, running a deficit is bad, and I will leave aside the surplus with Mars problem, and in the short run, and the short run is many years, things are going to get much worse. I like to say, since we're talking about Britain, and the British tend to pride themselves ludicrously, in my view, on what Margaret Thatcher contributed to their economy. The Thatcher reforms began in 1980, and the first time that it was obvious that they'd made a difference was in the late 1990s. So that was at least 15 years later. So that's the sort of time period I expect. In Germany, they seem to be a bit quicker, it just takes 10 years. So, given that we all accept that the Spanish labour market, I think most people accept, is even more screwed up than ours was, well, probably we're talking 20 years. You'll now tell me I'm wrong. So that you have a big short-run problem. And the question is what, and this fits in with Richard and the political questions, what happens to the politics in the meantime? And I think it's a pretty big question. I think there is no measure at the aggregate level, though I think there are measures that could be taken in terms of demand management, on which I think the ECB has been irresponsible, because I think it will turn out that the ECB's policies are going to be not deflationary in their own terms, but we'll see. But there are things that could be done at the aggregate level, but none of them are going to get big purchase on the big peripheral countries in the relevant period. So that's why I've stressed that once you've decided on the stock adjustment, there is going to have to be some financing of these countries if the politics are not going to blow up. But that's, of course, my judgment, and it's a judgment about politics on which I'm an amateur. But that seems to me the flow problem, and the flow problem is a very, very big problem. I'll come to the British side of this in a big issue. Richard asked about, he wanted me to introduce three additional elements into the European story. I just didn't have the time for that. I know some members of the St. Augustine Club, and I'm pretty convinced that some of the most important members of that are not going to join in the near future. Ex-members of the Eurozone, I don't expect that, like you, to be an empty set within 10 years. I just want to talk about, because you raised the very, very interesting question of how the new fiscal treaty is going to work. I've written a whole column on that some time ago, and I am looking forward to the jurisprudence in front of major courts in which they decide between various conflicting views of economists on what the structural, don't forget, the fiscal deficit that they are supposed to target is not an actual number. It's a notional number, the structural fiscal deficit. And as I have pointed out, estimates of the structural fiscal deficit for the years before the crisis by reputable bodies have altered by 4 or 5 percentage points of GDP since the crisis happened. In other words, in my view, this is fundamentally irresponsible and foolish legislation which cannot possibly be made justiciable in any effective court and regarded as politically legitimate. So what you're going to be doing is telling governments to slash deficits, cut taxes and cut spending and raise taxes on the proposition that they will otherwise fail to meet a notional target which cannot be measured by anybody at all. And if they don't, the duly elected governments of these countries will effectively, on their central policies, be overthrown. Even by the standards of the European Union, this strikes me as truly insane. The final area that was Pepper touched on, I can't comment on your solutions. I tend not to believe in them because I think the political parties just can't function cross-border because they are products of national politics, but we could discuss that. But I do think you defined the legitimation problem perfectly. And it's because you defined them perfectly, it brought me back exactly to my proposition of December 1991, that this is a political project, and the political project won't work. And this is very relevant, and it's really the last thing okay, I'll two comments, and then I'll stop. I know I've overrun, but these are enormous. The UK versus Spain. Actually, manufacturing hasn't been doing that badly. Financial services are such a catastrophe that they're overwhelmed by what's happened. There are, I think, 3 points I'd make about the UK. First, a view that I have held throughout and I've never varied on. The UK economy is structurally weak and has been so for a very, very long time, and things have tended to get worse. And this goes back, in my view, about 130 years. And the Thatcher Revolution, which was supposed to reform this, didn't. We can discuss why. But that is the reality. I don't believe that any of the structural reforms we're now talking about would reverse such a process, which is deeply historical. That's point one. Point two, if Britain had been in the euro, we would have been like Ireland, essentially. We would have had a bigger boom than we did and an even bigger bust. There's an interesting question, how much bigger? But by the way, I'm not talking now. That's what I thought when I opposed entry. So it was obvious we have a credit system like theirs, and if you provided us with Eurozone interest rates, we were going to have a property boom even worse than theirs, and no British government would stop it. Now, that's of course based on my proposition that British governments are incapable of stopping things like that. I don't want to give them the temptation. But that's my view. We will be in a bigger problem now. And then, of course, there's the final question, and here I think everybody has to decide for themselves. Clearly we are in a mess. I have no idea how long it will take, but the mess is our own. The responsibility for dealing with it is our own. And if we hate the government that is implementing a particular set of policies, we will get rid of it and replace it with another one. We don't, thank God, have to get involved in a major international war over our policies. Now, I don't know how this will end with Spain. I have no idea at all. But I'm going to put this as gently as I possibly can because I really don't want to be provocative. If in the current situation in Britain we had the Commission and assorted governments telling the British government what to do, there would be a complete and total political explosion and we'd be out. Other people may have a different view. That's just the reality. So we made, in my view, I did, and others like me, the correct political judgment. What that means for the long-term future, 20 years from now we can discuss Britain and Spain. I'll be a bit old then. Very last point, I like your proposals, but they wouldn't have made as much difference as I would have, as you might have hoped, given the incredibly large disequilibria that had emerged in the Eurozone in the run-up to the crisis, and the huge overhangs of rotten debt, bad lending that had occurred. And in any case, they were completely politically inconceivable. I've had many, many complaints from various senior representatives, this is the very last sentence, senior representatives of the business sector and the political sector in what we now call peripheral Europe, as you said, relocated. And my response to that was, it was obvious to me what you were joining and who was going to run it. Why wasn't it obvious to you?
Have a few more comments, questions. Sven.
I'm probably loud enough without the mic. I really am loud enough without the mic. Is this other big country that's also having some problems called the United States. And in fact, in many of the graphs you would, that you show, America would be in the middle or worse than many of the others. So I'm curious how you figure the American economy into this very, very negative picture. And secondly, what may be sound like a cute question, but it's not really, which is how does one explain the fact that the euro hasn't already collapsed?
Some monetary economists have recalled that we had for centuries a bimetallic monetary system in Europe. So in Renaissance Florence, you had the florent, which was based on gold. You had the spiccioli for the domestic transactions, which was based on silver. And some economists have said that this might offer a solution to the problem of promoting growth in Greece, Portugal, and other countries if you would offer them the option to remain in the euro, to continue with the euro in the international transactions, but you use the drachme for domestic transactions in order to devalue the domestic economy in order to become competitive again. Do you think this is academic utopia, or as it has functioned for centuries in Europe? And some economists like Milton Friedman have argued, I think, in favor of bimetallic monetary orders. Do you think there is a practical relevance of this idea?
I have two very short questions. The first one is, what is the probability you give to the two scenarios that you have suggested? You haven't attached any probabilities to them. And the second is, if a default has to come at some point, what do you think is better? A bank default, a government default, both, or what? Bank default, or so it's better that bondholders take a hit of a banks, or is better government bondholders? Or it doesn't matter according to you?
I wouldn't want so much to comment on those particular questions. I was going to comment on the issue of,
I meant in general,
right,
yeah.
on fiscal stimulus. So we were, Massimiliano and I were exchanging notes, and I think we agreed that the best fiscal stimulus, that Spain would solve a lot of Spain's problems if they spent some money teaching a lot of German language classes to young people in Spain. I think it would really clear up a lot of problems really quickly. Now, it sounds unthinkable. I've also suggested that one of the important solutions to Greece's problems would be to sell a bunch of their islands. That sounds a little bit unthinkable as well. But you know what? They're actually talking about doing that in Greece, and maybe they should start talking about teaching German in Spain. Any further comments?
Any of the researchers here? You're being shy, but there must be somebody who'd like to say something, ask something. Yeah.
Thank you. What I was wondering, I'm not an economist, so I'm not very knowledgeable in detail about this, but I think Martin makes a convincing case that this is a systemic crisis which is related to trade imbalances without corresponding fiscal transfers and labor mobility. So this seems to be a chronic condition. I mean, structural reforms are really going to change that much, so there is not a repetition of what already happened? Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for an interesting discussion. I would be curious to hear your reflections, Martin, on the current state of the economic profession, actually. You mentioned, it seems to me that the discussion, if we listen to it here, crises was considered the exception rather than the norm, that we could remove crises from our economic systems. Do you think there's something to be said for the economic profession to reconsider some of their core assumptions?
Fortunately, I wasn't asked to deal with the question of the US monetary union. I think it's very important, and perhaps it's failing to distinguish the shocks that have occurred within the Eurozone, which is what I've discussed, which have created some large internal problems, from the question of the US versus the European economy. Because clearly they are different sorts of questions, though there is a relationship. And of course there's a relationship between them. And it would take us very, very far now if we were going to discuss this. But if you look at the aggregate data for US versus the EU, say, and you look at per capita income, things like that, growth thereof, clearly you can make perfectly credible arguments that overall the US system is at least as defective as the European one. Not in some respects better, in other respects worse. It looks a bit better on aggregate productivity growth, but that's sort of iffy. Some very, very large, compared certainly to core Europe, inequality problems, comparisons. I think divergence among the citizenry is very considerable. Arguably even greater, though that's a big argument. But I think the difference that I was focusing on for this purpose is the US has a system that allows it to manage acute financial crises. And they did manage, rather when it got to the acute financial crisis quite effectively, and they've ended up with a series of chronic malaises which I find completely predictable and predicted. The reason one focuses on the Eurozone crisis, and this is why it's interesting, is that the crisis phenomenon, by which one means recurrent disruption in crucial markets in the financial system within important parts of the Eurozone, has been recurrent. And that's what you want to get rid of, I think. That's the issue, that's what's different. And it has to do with the nature of the system and where risks fall. And in essence, it comes down to the point that I made, which is that a large part of the risks in the system, the ultimate insurance risks, fall on governments that are clearly not capable of meeting those, of dealing with those risks. They're not valid insurers of last resort, while the federal government in the US is. Now, do you want that? That's a very big question. The assumption under the euro originally is that you didn't want it. But then the crisis hit, and it turned out actually people didn't like the consequences of it. So you end up in this difficult 50-50 state, but you're neither fish nor fowl. You're neither clearly a currency arrangement among countries which any one country can break, or an integrated federal union. You're neither, and that has some consequences in this specific area, and that's what I was focusing on. I don't find it surprising that the euro in aggregate is quite strong, because in buying the euro you're buying a put on option on a number of countries that have very, very strong external positions. And whatever happens, you're still going to own big chunks of that. Above all, of course, Germany. The question on parallel currencies, there's lots of discussion of parallel currencies. There was lots of discussion. I remember the British floated with vast enthusiasm the idea that the euro, or it wasn't then called the euro, I think it was called the ECU then, should be a parallel currency, not a new currency. I have no particular problem with trying this. I think there are natural tendencies for very well understood reasons for people to end up converging on one. And as Adam Smith pointed out at vast length, bimetallism doesn't work if you've got fixed price relationships between the two, but if you float between the two, there's no great problem. I just don't think it's something that people are going to try now. And there are some very large technical questions involved in deciding exactly how the introduction of your new drachma would work. I mean, you'd have we can go great lengths. I've thought quite a lot about it. How would you do it? There are many different ways you can use it as an accounting unit, but if you have a central bank in this thing and then you have to work out the relationship between the central bank in drachma and the European Central Bank, and you end up with the sorts of problems that David was talking about in Argentina, where they did actually effectively issue money, and it created some large problems. What are my probabilities on these outcomes? Given what the ECB has been doing recently, from the German point of view, debauching the currency, and from the periphery point of view, providing a nice blank check, thank you very much, and who knows what, I would guess the probabilities of survival have increased a little, or as I put it, the probability that it will be a German exit has increased, and the probability that it will be a Greek exit has diminished. Now, actually, in aggregate, which is the more likely, I don't know. But I remain of the sort of view that there's, I've thought of it as oscillating around 50-50. At the moment, I think survival is a good deal higher than that because of this. But I still think the most likely outcome is that Germany's going to leave. The economic protection, oh yes, two other questions. Yes, this is a chronic condition, and to some extent an insoluble one. I think the most interesting question to everybody who followed this debate, and it's remained open in many different dimensions, you can make arguments on either side, is how far, in order to survive politically, a union of this kind needs to have the attributes of federal states like the US, Australia, or Canada, and indeed how far it cannot survive politically if it gets the attributes of federal states like US, Canada, and Australia. I mean, that seems to me the absolute core tension. What is the nature of a European polity? And you can argue very powerfully that it is necessary and that it is impossible. And I think that's the core. It's impossible because a transfer union is illegitimate, because people see their money as belonging to their state, their collective, and it is necessary because without it the other adjustment mechanisms aren't acceptable, and we've seen that these other adjustment mechanisms aren't actually acceptable. Finally, on the economic profession, well, I have to say economics has got really interesting. I'm very sorry that I'm at this age before, but I think the interesting thing that, I mean, none of it's new. It's all been in economics, it's all been in the discussion, and so forth. But clearly, we have been reminded, because it's part of the background to this story, within Europe and globally, that and we can discuss at enormous length what it means, it is possible for financial systems in aggregate to make what appear in ex post to be extraordinarily bad judgments about risk. I'm not going to talk about euro at all, but my favorite chart on this, and I think it will be my last point, comes from Adair Turner's evaluation of the financial crisis. He's the chairman of our Financial Services Authority, and he has a lovely chart on CDS swaps, which are a technical market operated by highly competent professionals, in theory. The CDS swap market for banks. And the point at which the CDS swap spreads reached their lowest level ever was July 2007. That is a problem. That's a problem. That tells you a really rather large mistake was being made, or the markets were functioning in some really rather profoundly distorted way to reach these conclusions, which happen to include estimates, obviously, of the viability of a large number of banks, every one of which was effectively insolvent within a year, or within a year and a half, to a greater or lesser degree. So economics has got very, very interesting. There are main parts of it, which I discussed, which I think are pretty solid, but again, it is a fact which we cannot, it really is the last, which we cannot sort of understate, that up to early 2009, late 2008, early 2009, the markets judged the riskiness of every Eurozone sovereign as absolutely equivalent. That's pretty strange. And by the way, I'm not saying it now. I wrote before what the hell is going on here. There was a lot of literature on what the hell is going on. How can it possibly make sense? Except, by the way, Ireland had a negative spread on Germany. I don't know how many people know that Ireland had a negative spread on Germany in 2006. Anyway, small, very small. The point is, we had some very, very disturbing phenomena in markets, and this led people to conclude things which turned out at least exposed, and we can discuss what that means, which were very, very wrong, and led to financial flows that should never have happened, to people who should never have been allowed to borrow, and as a result of which we got 3 million, how many millions of houses were built in Spain that are empty? Somebody will tell me. But anyway, it's a very, very large number. And that is really important. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I'm going to thank all our panelists, and particularly Martin, of course, for starting off that discussion, for continuing the discussion. Thank you to those of you who contributed, to those of you who listened. I think it was a really good discussion and a good start of our Debating Europe for this academic year. The next one will be, just to remind you, on 31st October when we have Ulrich Beck from Munich talking on Europe at Risk, the Cosmopolitan Turn. So come along to that as well. But thank you once again, Martin.